Welcome back, guys. This is Days of Noah number 9. So let's quickly review. We've been talking about the ancient masters of the ancient wisdom. And here we see a picture of Master Jesus. He's one of the masters of the ancient wisdom in the Theosophy or the Theosophical Society. It's a religion. And it's religion based on Eastern mysticism, so it's kind of like a hybrid religion. It's also collectively called the Great White Brotherhood, with white being in reference to these light beings in the Ascended Master teachings. And so it's a group of religions based on theosophy. And the Master Jesus is regarded as the master of the sixth ray. And so he's taken so many initiations in order to get to this point. We'll discuss that in a minute. Here's a picture of him over here on the right. It's got your classic Jesus with the beard. The pineal gland is lit up in the forehead. We see the long hair. We see the all-seeing eye, which is the same eye that's on our dollar bill. We already discussed the meaning of that. That's the eye of Horus or Lucifer, the great architect of the universe who's the god of this world. And then, of course, around the eye you see all the different symbols, the yin and the yang and the cross, and the moon and the sun, and all the different religious mystical symbols saying that all these religions are really one. And that's going to serve as the New Age religion one day. The New Age religion is going to be that we all acknowledge the same God. We just have different mechanisms to get there. You may choose Buddha as your mechanism, your vehicle to get to God, and they may choose Krishna, and these people may choose Muhammad, and the Native Americans may have their method, but we all worship the same God, and they're all equal ways to get to God. And there's nothing special about Jesus, even though he went to the cross and died, and it's that blood sacrifice is what cleanses you and gives you atonement to make it to God. You don't really need him because there's many ways to God. You can get to him amongst hundreds of different ways based on hundreds of different religions. And so I wanted to read some verses from Matthew 24 that say, this is Jesus talking about the last days, and he's talking about some of the signs that you can look for, besides the wars and the rumors of wars and all the natural disasters and so forth. But he says in Matthew 24, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. And then if anyone says to you, Behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect." And although I don't think the full manifestation of this verse has happened yet, because truly in the last days there will be some false prophets in Christ who will be doing some really supernatural things that'll just be mind-boggling to humanity, so much so that even the elect will want to believe that. But I think we're seeing a precursor to that here and now. These ancient masters who you're able to communicate with, who give you this secret information about life, who are portraying themselves to be masters like Christ, they're these false Christs and these false prophets who are, showing great signs. If they're coming from the supernatural and people are communicating with them, I consider that to be a sign and a wonder. So straight off of Wikipedia, ascended masters of the ancient wisdom are believed to be spiritually enlightened beings who in past incarnations were ordinary humans who have undergone a series of spiritual transformations originally called initiations. This is a spiritual evolution, if you will. Now, an ascended master is based on the theosophical concepts of the masters of the ancient wisdom. A regular master is just a human being who's taken the fifth initiation and is thereby capable of dwelling in the fifth dimension. An ascended master, on the other hand, is a human being who's taken the sixth initiation, and that's also referred to as the ascension, and so he's thereby capable of dwelling in the sixth dimension. Now, an ascended master is a human being who has regained full union with his mighty I Am presence. And when a human being has regained full union with his mighty I Am presence, That state of full union is referred to as ascension. And technically, a human being ascends when he takes the sixth initiation and not before. So those who have taken the seventh initiation hold the senior administrative posts in the Great White Brotherhood on Earth. These senior administrative posts are divided into three categories. We have the Department of Manu, the Department of the Planetary Christ, that's the Christ consciousness, and the Department of the Mahakakan. Now, the Lord of the World is a human being or another organism. I think that's interesting. But the Lord of the World is a human being or other organism who has taken the ninth initiation. And according to the Ascended Master teachings, the ninth initiation is the highest initiation possible, which is believed to be a ninth dimensional planet grid, such as Earth. They're saying Earth has 9 dimensions. We live in 3 dimensions, right? Height, width, and length. Time makes number 4, so we live in a 4-dimensional time space. And so above the 4th, obviously, are the 5th, the 6th, all the way through. Now, Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum physics prove that there are at least 10 dimensions. So these upper dimensions, other words for those would be upper heavens, upper realms. You know, the Bible talks all about these spiritual realms that are higher than our realms that we can't see, but we interface with them all the time, and we open doors between us and the spirit realms all the time, and that's what the witchcraft and things are doing that we've been discussing. So this group are also acknowledging these higher dimensions. They just have a different spin on it. So this whole concept was originally presented by Helena Blavatsky in the 1870s. Now she's the one that channeled the book, The Secret Doctrine. So it's a channeled object, and it has a lot of this New Age meaning in it. It's a very popular book. You know, you can go on Google and look at it. It's going to be expensive. There's a lot of people who are reading this book. It's the idea that the masters of the ancient wisdom was adopted by people who at some point had a connection with a theosophical movement such as Alice Bailey. Now she's another person who has multiple charged doctrines. She wrote the book called The Externalization of the Hierarchy, and we'll get into that later when we're talking about the United Nations. But basically, when you study Alice Bailey, she had her own publishing company called Lucifer Trust. Why did she name it that? I think it's pretty obvious, because in her mind, Lucifer is the malevolent or the benevolent being who illuminated man's eyes and is helping them become like gods. Of course, Lucifer Trust had a negative connotation, and she got some bad press out of it, so she now changed it to Lucis Trust, which is short for Lucifer. And if you study her writings, she has many, many volumes of books that were all channeled to her by a different entity. I believe it was DJ Qual. We'll get into those other ascended masters later as we look at some of their channeled documents. But essentially, a large portion of the United Nations Charter is based on Alice Bailey's writings, which were spiritually charged and received from her spirit guides. And we're going to go specifically into the United Nations Charter and some of the world prayers that they recite that come from Alice Bailey. So, and this is also true with Helena Roerich, right? She was a medium and a psychic who received lots of charged information from Master Moira. And you'll find that women, for whatever reason, seem to be more connected in this regard. You know, the Nazis, all of the mediums and psychics were women. When you see a lot of the fortune tellers and people in today's society, a large majority of them are women. You have Helena Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, Helena Roerich, all women. Even going back as far as Greece, if you remember the Oracle of Delphi, which was the ancient oracle or prophetess, if you would, they would burn incense and it would give off a vapor, and she would breathe it in. Then she would consult with the spirits, and then she would give you an accurate foretelling of what was going on. And so for whatever reason, women seem to be highly in tune to this. But you can see it with men as well, and there's a 33rd degree Freemason. He's one of the more famous Freemasons of the last century by the name of Manly P. Hall, and he wrote the book that you see on the right, The Secret Destiny of America, and it discusses the mysterious origins and the unique mission of America. And we're going to discuss that in a minute. But before we do, I want to read a verse to you in Timothy. 1 Timothy 4 says, "Now the Holy Spirit expressly says that in the later times, the last days, many will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and the teachings of devils and demons." If you look that word up in the Greek, it's didache daimonoia, doctrines of devils. And so what Paul is saying to Timothy is in the last days, there's going to be a lot of demonically inspired and demonically charged religious doctrines that will totally lead many people astray. And they'll be masquerading, like that verse says, how Satan and all of his ministers of righteousness masquerade as ministers of righteousness through the transformation process, metaschemazomoi, where they disguise themselves as the light. And that's what it comes down to. You have the true light and you have the counterfeit light. It's like a dollar bill. If I give you a counterfeit dollar bill, you're not going to recognize it's a counterfeit unless you're fully acquainted with an authentic dollar bill. It's the same thing here. If you don't know the scriptures, if you don't know the verses, if you don't know the Lord, then naturally it's easy to be deceived and fall for the counterfeit religions and the counterfeit doctrines. Now, the reason why I'm including Manly Hall in this lecture series is because he's a fascinating guy and he had a lot to say. You'll notice on the book here, 1944 was when this book was published, The Secret Destiny of America. This is literally on the heels of the seal being put on the dollar. And so for him to document this so fast, just within a couple years after that seal was placed on the dollar, tells you that he obviously had knowledge about it. And he's a 33rd degree Freemason. We've already went in great detail about Nicholas Roerich, who was a Mason, Henry Wallace, who was a Mason, Truman, FDR, all of them. And so Manly Hall describes the secret destiny of America. And he goes back and all the way back to people like Sir Francis Bacon and Franklin and many of the forefathers and what their original goal was for the West. They recognized that there was a continent up where it is in the West. And at that time, they referred to America as the New Atlantis. And if you remember, Atlantis was this utopian society. It was kind of a one-world system of freedom and principles for all. And it was, it's this kind of mythological, unicorn society that is almost too good to be true. Well, they always had a plan for America. America was to be this new Atlantis. And on the surface, it seems like it's very altruistic, that they're just trying to look after the goodwill of men. But really, when you get to the deeper levels of it, you realize that it's more parallel to what I described with the dollar before, with George Washington and the Omega sign. That the true secret destiny of America, although it's been an amazing nation, it was a great Christian nation, it helped spread the gospel and it helped liberate a lot of people, that eventually democracy would run dry because those who are responsible for it would become spoiled and they would become entitled and they would exploit it, and eventually it would lead to something totally different. And that usually happens after about 250 years of a republic, which is what history, when you go back and look at the different nations, that's usually about the timeline. And so our republic has kind of it's seen its best days, and now we're kind of on the backside of that, and we're seeing that through all the geopolitical turmoil and everything going on in this country. And that essentially the true secret destiny of America is exactly what those symbols show. That the great architect of the universe, who's looking after this nation and this whole world, is steering us along to this one world currency and this one world order for the purposes of creating the foundation and the landscape for the beast system described in the book of Revelations, which is the last day system before the Antichrist can take power and move into the mark of the beast and the total enslavement of the whole world through this global consciousness where we're all going to be transhuman and hooked up to the internet and basically one enslaved beehive mentality. And we're going to get into the whole global consciousness and beehive mentality and look at those things later, but I'm just trying to bring it out now. Now you may say, okay, once again, Dave, you're delving into all that conspiracy theory, but you've got to look at the fruit. And we already talked about the verses in the Bible about witchcraft and sorcery and necromancy, and God doesn't want you communicating with spiritists and channelers, and He doesn't want you consulting the stars and the monthly prognosticators. So Manly Hall, one of the leading 33rd degree Freemasons, he didn't want to leave this world with all of the secret knowledge that he spent his whole life working towards. So he wrote many books. Those books weren't really meant for the public at that time, but of course they are now. And here's just a few of them. Here's a handful of his books. We'll start in the top left, The Secret History of America. And you see the dollar symbol behind it with the all-seeing eye. The Secret Teaching of All Ages. You see the six-pointed star inside of a circle. We've already talked about that. That's a hexagram. That's the predominant symbol in witchcraft for putting a curse on somebody. The Lost Keys of Freemasonry. So right here he confirms that he's a Mason. The Secret Teaching of All Ages, and we see the horoscope. The Story of Astrology, the zodiac signs and everything to do with star worship and all of paganism. The Phoenix. The phoenix is a mythological bird who, once it reaches its highest state of evolution, it then destroys itself from within. It burns itself down into ashes, and out of the ashes of its old self births an egg, which will then later turn into another phoenix that's of a higher order. And so this is the classic symbol of the Freemasons, is the mythological phoenix. And when you study the dollar bill, the eagle was originally a phoenix, and that has been completely verified and vetted. Later they changed it to an eagle in order to confuse us and throw us off. But think about that symbolism for a second. The phoenix is supposed to be this bird that's going to rise up and become all-powerful, but eventually it will, hit its peak, and then as it starts the decline, it will then destroy itself from inside out, kind of like our country right now. And then once it's finally totally decimated itself, out of the ashes of the old system, birth the new and better system. Or at least that's what the cell is going to be, right? When all the calamities come and the economy crashes and they keep messing with the dollar and they keep devaluing the currency, and we eventually see concepts like hyperinflation. And I don't know when these things will happen. I don't know if it's next year or 20 years from now, but it will happen. And when these things happen, people are going to be begging for change. And that's when all of the nations will get together, the G8, the G20 nations will get together, and they'll have to come up with a solution. And the solution will have already been worked out. The details of that solution will have already been worked out. And the job of the elites is to create the chaos so that you can lead to the new solution. That's why they have the old expression, the old Latin expression, ordo ab chaos, which is order out of chaos. And I'm going to include some slides on that later. But essentially, the elites, one of their mottos is what they call the Hegelian dialectic. We're going to create the chaos so that then we can create the order from the chaos. So currently, the chaos is they're destroying the West, they're devaluing Christian principles, They're devaluing the dollar. They're creating geopolitical turmoil. They're slowly bringing down the West. It's a process. It's like erosion on a mountain. It's not overnight. It's incrementally. And then when the rest of us are just on our knees begging for some relief, they'll say, you know what? Okay, we've got something better for you. And then they'll roll out the carpet to this new world order system, and it will look and sound sexy and be packaged to us in a way that we will want to receive it. But of course, there's always the hook on the other end. So that is essentially what the mythological bird, the phoenix, represents. Now, if you continue on with the books, Freemasonry of the Ancient Egyptians, right there. Manly Hall wrote a book about the connection between Egyptology. So that explains why we have all that symbolism on our dollar bill. How about the pineal gland, the eye of God? He describes how to open up the pineal gland to communicate with the spirits. The Oedipus in the Eastern esoteric tradition. Oedipus are basically another word for magician, sage, witch. And then lastly here we see a book on Atlantis, the ancient mythological land of Atlantis, where they created this one world utopian society. So you can see here, I'm not making this stuff up. This is just one guy, Manly Hall, who wrote the book Secret Destiny of America. And so we have to take these things into consideration. So often the elites think about and speak about something called the Hegelian dialectic. And it's after a famous German philosopher by the name of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And Hegel was famous for talking about this formula that he has, which is basically what you can see over here on the far right, top right. Step 1 is create the problem. Step 2 is control the reaction. And then step 3 is offer the solution. So he refers to this as the thesis, which leads to the antithesis. And then when you combine the two, you get the synthesis. It's kind of complicated, but really it's not that complicated. It's kind of like our geopolitical system today. When you polarize a group of people, polarization is to create a positive and negative charge. And so there was a time in this country when, for example, the Democratic and Republican parties, although they had their obvious differences, they had a lot of commonalities. And it was the couple of differences that they would debate, and that would swing people one way or another. But for the most part, there was a lot of similarities and commonalities. But over time, the plan has been to create polarization and separate the country. And so now, when you listen to the debates, you can't find one single subject that they actually see eye to eye on. You've got one that's a positive charge and the other that's a negative charge, so that they naturally repel each other. And that's what creates polarization, because us, the people, as the consumer, if you will, we have to make a decision on which group we're going to identify with. And so once we pick one group, whether it be the left or the right, then obviously there's a line that's been drawn in the sand, and you're now being pitted against the other group. And so this was all by design, of course. And I'm not going to get heavily into politics, but when you look at the progression of politics over the last 100 years, from the different Freemasons and everybody involved, you'll see that the two different parties are two different sides to the same coin, and often in the long run we end up in the same place, irrespective of who was running the country. Now, currently, the elites, one of their symbols is the double-headed phoenix, as you see here in the middle. And you notice that there's a 33 with a downward shaped pyramid, and that 33 represents the 33 levels of Freemasonry. And of course, at the top you see the Latin motto, Ordo ab Chao, which means order from chaos. In other words, they create the chaos, so that out of the ashes of that chaos there will be required a response to create order out of it, and that's ultimately what they wanted in the first place. So on the top left, the Hegelian dialectic is a framework for guiding thoughts and actions into conflicts that lead to synthetic solutions which can only be introduced once those being manipulated take a side that will advance the predetermined agenda. Okay? So this is what we call controlled opposition. You have guys like Rahm Emanuel who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's basically what we're dealing with here, is the Hegelian dialectic in this world and in this country. But to get back to the symbolism, anytime you see a phoenix, especially a double-headed phoenix, and that's always representative of order from chaos. This is why we've seen so many false flags throughout history. Things like the Gulf of Tonkin incident that triggered Vietnam, and other incidents such as 9/11. There's a lot of false flags that are pre-engineered and pre-designed to try and help synthesize and lead to a specific solution, like a police state, for example, or Big Brother, or the war in Iraq, for example. Do you really think it's a coincidence that George Herbert Walker Bush was the first one to have the first Desert Storm War, and then a decade later his son went back to the same place for a second war? And of course we were told that Osama bin Laden and the terrorists had brought down the towers. And then the next thing you know, we're talking about going into Iraq. And people are saying, wait a second, I thought it was Osama bin Laden that attacked us. Not Saddam Hussein and Iraq, but rather Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. And then the narrative changes, right? It says, well, that's true. Saddam Hussein was not responsible for 9/11, neither was Iraq, but we're still going back there because now we have intel that tells us they have weapons of mass destruction. And then, of course, when we go over into the second Desert Storm War, we never recover any of these weapons. So what's the point? It's a perfect point. It's, they created the problem by helping incite events like 9/11. Then out of the ashes of that gives the country justification to back the government into making military moves in order for them to come up with a solution. And the solution was that they wanted to secure that area. They wanted to affect the control and power of the Middle East and oil, etc. And so this is a perfect example of the Hegelian dialectic. Now people are going to say, well, that's conspiracy theory. No, that's conspiracy fact. The reality of it is we were attacked, according to the official story, we were attacked by Osama bin Laden and the Taliban from Afghanistan. And we ended up going into Iraq to fight Saddam Hussein as a response of that attack. Now explain that. And the explanation was weapons of mass destruction, which were never recovered. So that's the official story, and obviously it doesn't line up. Then when you put it in context with the fact that, we have two different Bush presidents, a decade apart, both of who went into the same region, is that a coincidence or what? A lot of things were created from 9/11. The government was able to make many inroads into the police state and Big Brother through the 9/11 event. They were able to develop the Department of Homeland Security, which didn't exist prior to 9/11. They were able to create the Patriot Act, which removes many freedoms from the Constitution. They were able to create the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, which strips away many freedoms as well. And so it also helped perpetuate the war on terror, which is a war that can never be won. Kind of like the war on drugs that the Reagan administration pushed through 30 years ago. And, obviously today we can look around the country and the world and see that war was a war against an ideal. It wasn't against a group of people. It was against this idea of stopping drugs. It never worked, just like this war on terrorism will never work. But this is how the elites do it. They come up with false flags, they create the problems, then they control the reaction, and then they offer the synthetic solution to the predetermined agenda. Okay, we're going to move on to Mr. Aleister Crowley. Aleister is one of the most notorious people of the 20th century. He has a lot of deep, rich history. He's written many books. He's done interviews. There's a lot of information about him that you can research. And he was one of the main occultists and ceremonial magicians of the 20th century. And when we're talking about magic, we're not talking about the sleight of hand, with cards and making a coin disappear magic. We're talking about magic as it relates to doing rituals and witchcraft and etc. So Aleister Crowley, he was born in 1875. He died in 1947. We talked about that earlier, that was a very prophetic time. That's when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. That's right on the heels of the Israel becoming a nation. And also it's the Roswell incident, which we're going to get to here shortly. I believe that's related to Aleister here. And so, interestingly enough, that's when Nicholas Roerich also passed away. So we have two of the famous occultists of the 20th century who died in 1947. Aleister has a very interesting background. He was born to a strong Christian family of the Plymouth Brethren, which are kind of like a sect of Quakers, if you will, very strict Christian home. And he grew up with his family reading him the Bible. He was very familiar with Scripture. He was very familiar with Jesus Christ. Now, I've always said that obviously experiences can shape and mold people. We all are born into this world as innocent little babies, and then the world begins to shape and mold us, and it can turn us into Mother Teresa's, or it can turn us into Adolf Hitler's. Well, one of the influencing factors in Aleister's life was that he lost a baby sister at a young age, and so he experienced death early. But I think the thing that really sent him off the rails, if you will, is when his father died of throat and tongue cancer at around 11 years old. And Aleister was obviously very distraught by experiencing this. And he kind of took a position of, why would God allow this to happen, where my father would have to die so prematurely in such a violent way? And so that was where he really began to push back against his Christian roots. And as he went into his adolescent phase, he started becoming quite rebellious. So much so that his mother nicknamed him the Beast. Now, we all have to be very careful about the things that we say to our children, because Jesus says, by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned. And we have to remember that words can create. And so when we build people up and lift them up, that can be very positive. When we condemn people and say that, you say things to your children, it can have a lasting effect. Now, I'm not going to pin all this on Aleister's mother. I'm sure she was a contributing factor. There were a lot of forces that led to his development. Either way, as time went on, he began to identify with the Antichrist in the book of Revelations. So much to the point that he basically changed his name to Master Therion. And Therion is the Greek word for beast. Whenever you read the book of Revelations, if you look at the Greek, and whenever you see the word beast, that number, that is Therion. And he personally identified with the number 666 as his own personal identification number. So he wanted to be the Antichrist. Make no mistake about that. He was against God. He was angry with God. He was angry with Jesus. And so anytime you rebel, you always go the opposite direction. And so this was the beginning for him. In his early life, he started becoming confused about his sexuality. And then after that, he traveled to India, of all places. Now, we spent a lot of time studying Eastern mysticism, so this shouldn't shock you. But he went to India. He got a guru. He spent a lot of time learning the different Eastern mystical arts. And he became steeped in Buddhism and Hinduism. He learned how to do transcendental meditation. He learned how to astral project out of his body. He learned how to communicate with spirit guides. And so now, basically, Aleister was primed and ready to become this English occultist and magician. Eventually, he ends up back in his homeland of England, and he does a lot of different things, but essentially, he gets himself, the British press dub him as the wickedest man in the world, and he gets himself exiled from his own country. And as far as I know, he was legally required to leave and was not able to come back. And so that projected him into the United States. At a young age, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a strong occult group, kind of like the Theosophical Society. And while he was there, he actually became the founder of his own religion, which is called Thelema. Now, it's based on an older religion, Hermeticism. We talked about Trisgestus, or Hermes Trisgestus, earlier. He's the ancient mystic who wrote the book about as above, so below, and so we've studied that. So Aleister Crowley became steeped in Hermeticism and Gnosticism and Buddhism and Hinduism, and he kind of merged them all together, and he created his own religion called Thelema. Meanwhile, shockingly, he became a high-level Freemason as well, because you see, these things all go hand in hand. This is what I said at the beginning of when we started round 2, that it's all layered. There's lots of different subjects that seem independent from one another. For example, Buddhism, Hinduism, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Freemasonry. You could say each of those are individual subject matters, but we're seeing a lot of commonality within each of them. The same spirits working through all of them. Now, for anybody who denies that Aleister Crowley is a Mason, here's a photograph of him in the middle. He's a 32nd degree Freemason, and here he's wearing the Masonic regalia, so there's no question whatsoever. Meanwhile, if you look closely at the inscribings on that picture, you'll see the symbol and the word Baphomet. Now, we know who Baphomet is. He's the pagan goat, right? The hybrid, half human, half goat, transgendered goat. He's the androgynous combination of male-female, who is basically represents the as above and so below symbolization, which is the basis of all Hermeticism. So, moving on. If you look over here to the right, you'll see an image of Aleister Crowley. Now, the first thing you'll see is he has a book on witchcraft. He has a 5-pointed star inside of a circle, which is a pentagram, one of the more powerful symbols used in rituals. The reason why these symbols are always enclosed in a circle, and the reason why when they do satanic rituals, they'll always draw a circle and then they'll do everything on the inside is because that represents the space or that vortex that they're opening up. And so they refer to that as the cone of energy. And that's that energy that they're opening up, that demonic energy that they're bringing into our world from the higher dimensions. They have to be able to maintain that energy or it'll just disperse in different directions. And so that sacred symbol of the circle helps keep that energy solidified within that space until they're able to conclude their ritual and then release it upon whomever or however they choose to do. So we see in the top right that Aleister has that book. He has a pyramid hat on his head because he's steeped in Egyptology, because they were obviously very well known for their witchcraft and sorcery. And of course he has the all-seeing eye symbol that we see on our dollar bill. And so this should remind you again that this is an occult symbol. I mean, look at this guy. This guy is a Luciferian and an occultist, one of the most powerful ones in the 20th century, and he has the same symbol on his forehead that we have on the dollar. And I already proved that was a Masonic symbol, and here you see him wearing the Masonic regalia. So this isn't a coincidence, and this isn't conspiracy. This is fact. Now you'll notice that that all-seeing eye is actually the eye of Horus, and we're going to get into that later. The eye of Horus represents the pineal gland. That's why it's on his forehead. And you'll notice too that it has the 1,000 points of illumination, or the sunburst effect around it, which is really to symbolize Lucifer, the light bearer, or the Illuminati, the one who brought illumination to mankind. Now, you'll also notice a little nuance to that all-seeing eye with the sunburst effect around it, is that if you look at, I took that down in the bottom right-hand corner, and sure enough, it makes a 6-pointed star. The sunburst effect is shaped like a hexagram. So that was pretty clever on Aleister's part to make that. And so one of the interesting things is, today Aleister Crowley has become legendary in the world of the occult, but also Wiccan circles. And when you study witchcraft, it's really interesting. There is a Christian author by the name of Bill Schnoebelen. He is a very interesting person. His last name is spelled Schnoebelen. And Bill has a very unique and checkered past in that when he was a young man, he got into the occult just like Aleister. He ended up becoming a druidic high priest for the Druids, which is kind of like witchcraft in a way. And while he was a druidic high priest, while he was climbing up the ranks of that, meanwhile, he was also climbing the ranks throughout the Catholic Church, and he became a Catholic priest, which is strange. He's a Catholic priest by day and a druidic high priest by night. Eventually, that ran its course, and he left that and actually joined the Mormon Church of all things and became an elder in the LDS Church. And while he was there, he was also became a high-level Freemason simultaneously. Now, that may sound surprising, but if you study the Mormon Church, it's not surprising at all, because the Mormon Church is basically based on Freemasonry. Joseph Smith was a 33rd degree Freemason. All of the rituals, the handshakes, the temples, the whole 9 yards that we see in the Mormon Church are all basically a counterfeit and a knockoff of the Masonic religion, if you will. Joseph Smith basically took his Masonic training and he tweaked it, he added some things to it, he subtracted some things to it, and he made his own hybrid religion called the Church of Mormonism. And so this guy, Bill Schnoebelen, became a high-level Mason and a high-level Mormon at the same time, which is pretty fascinating, especially considering the fact that previously he was a Catholic priest and a Druidic priest as well. And he claims that while he was a Druidic priest and a Catholic priest, that he also, that's the period of time that he went through vampirism and blood drinking. So, like I said, the guy's got a crazy testimony. He's got many videos on YouTube. He's wrote a lot of amazing books. Eventually he left the Mormon Church. He got saved, received the Holy Spirit, became a true Christian and a true follower of Christ and a true follower of the Bible. And so now he's able to be used by the Lord to reveal a lot of things from the past, from these different organizations. And he's written some really good books. One of them, which I highly recommend, is called Blood on the Doorposts, and it's an excellent book that talks about things like spiritual warfare. It talks about how sin is connected to demonization and how to break strongholds in your life, and it's really a very interesting book. But he also wrote a book later called Wicca, Satan's Little White Lie. And so Wicca is one of the fastest growing religions today. And one of the things that Bill discusses in this book, Wicca, Satan's Little White Lie, is that in the 1950s, Wicca really started to take off, and it turns out that a lot of the literature that Gardner and the other leaders of the Wicca movement, they had received a lot of their information and literature and teaching and training and symbolism from, nonetheless, Aleister Crowley. And so we're not going to give Aleister all the credit for the Wicca movement, but he definitely was a significant influence in the formation of Wicca, which is basically modern day witchcraft. Now, modern day witches don't believe in Satan. If you ask them about Satan, they don't believe in the entity Satan. They probably don't even believe in Lucifer either. They believe in, the moon, and they're pagans, so they believe in star worship and sun worship, and they believe in Mother Gaia and the earth, and a lot of different gods and goddesses. They do believe in Cernulos, which is the horned god who represents male fertility. But so you see that there's all this crossover between these different organizations, and Aleister was one of the most influential people in the 20th century, and we're going to spend some real time talking about him because now that we've paved a lot of the groundwork, it's time for us to begin to move into the UFO phenomenon and how it ties into everything that we've been discussing. Another interesting connection is that witchcraft, they refer to witchcraft as the craft. And interestingly enough, in the Masonic group, they also refer to Freemasonry as the craft. So there's just a lot of interesting similarities. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Aleister and his wife, Rose Kelly. There's a lot of information out there on Aleister. I've been studying him for many years. I've read lots of his books. I've listened to lots of commentaries on him. And so I'm going to try and present this information as accurately as I can. So Aleister ends up marrying a woman named Rose Kelly, and it turns out that she's a high-level medium and psychic. And so together they decide to go on their honeymoon in Egypt for obvious reasons, because people into the occult are into Egyptology, as we've discussed in the past. Now, apparently, back in those days, which this was in 1904, you could rent out the king's chamber within the Great Pyramid of Giza. And this is what Aleister and his wife Rose had their honeymoon. And while there, staying the night, they decided to perform a bornless ritual. Now you can imagine what kind of stuff has taken place in this chamber over the last couple millennia, dating back to the pharaohs. And I'm sure there's some pretty powerful spiritual entities hanging around this place. Nonetheless, they decided to perform a bornless ritual, which is a ritual to try and invoke the creator of the universe, the one who is bornless, the one who was not created, but has always been there. And so they did a ceremonial magical ritual and tried to invoke the creator of the universe. Now, during this ritual, Rose, who's the psychic in this situation, she allows an entity to come into her as she goes into a trance, and then she says, "They're waiting for you, Aleister," in reference to Horus, the sun god of ancient Egypt, who we've discussed. From here, they were instructed to go to the Cairo Museum, where Rose would lead Aleister to a painted wooden tablet called the Stele of Revealing, which displays a picture of Horus. Now just hang with me here. I know it sounds kind of complicated, but you're going to see the supernatural sophistication of it here as we proceed forward. So here in the bottom left picture, you can see a picture of the king's chamber. You can see there's a hole where the moon can shine through, and in the center is the tomb. And you can see on the right that there's a silhouette there where someone's been in there before. So, to me, I can only imagine sleeping in this place. That would be freaky enough as it is, but to go ahead and do a ceremonial ritual to try and invoke a spirit is pretty crazy. Nonetheless, that's what they did, and they succeeded in invoking that spirit. All right, so now this is just a depiction of the Cairo Museum. The Cairo Museum in the 1900s was one of the biggest museums in the world. It had just tons and tons and tons of artifacts and architecture and statues and all kinds of inventory within it. And when you come here to the right, when you see this cabinet, here in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a yellow tablet right here. This is the Stele of Revealing. So here's a picture of the Stele of Revealing from the Cairo Museum. On the left, we see the front of the wooden tablet. Now, this was a wooden tablet that was painted by Egyptian priests that date back to the 25th dynasty, which is approximately 680 BCE. So a long time ago. And in this depiction on the left, you can see one of the Egyptian priests presenting or offering a sacrifice to the falcon-headed god Horus. Now in this picture, really it's Ra, Horus, and Osiris, the three of them, and we refer to this as the Egyptian Trinity. And so this priest is making sacrifice to Horus. Now above Horus, you'll see the winged solar disk, and that is a representation of the Egyptian gods. And we're going to see that later when we study symbolism within Hollywood and music, in Katy Perry's music, so remember that disc. And of course, you notice that this Horus, this falcon-headed god, is obviously a hybrid. We've already discussed this, that the fallen angels created the hybrids, and these hybrids were manifesting in all of these cultures, as we see here. Now, what's interesting is on the back of this painted tablet, at the top, you'll see the number 666 because that's the number of this tablet within the inventory within the museum. And this, of course, was the confirmation to Crowley. When he saw this, he knew that he was communicating with Horus. All right, so I'm going to summarize this one more time because this is important that you get this. Aleister Crowley, a guy who's a practitioner in the occult, marries Rose Kelly, a medium. They go to Egypt, they do their honeymoon in the king's chamber, they do a bornless ritual to try and communicate with one of the higher gods of the universe, and naturally this is a charged area where there's a lot of stuff that's happened in the past, and so these entities are hanging around. One of them enters Rose, she speaks to Aleister and communicates with him that Horus is waiting for him at the Cairo Museum. And so obviously then the next day or days after, they leave that place, they go to the Cairo Museum, and obviously Rose is still charged with this entity because they walk through the museum. There's thousands and thousands of items. They're going through the inventory. They turn the corner and there's a number 20, number 21, number 22, all the way up to 600. 601, 602, and when they come to the Stele of Revealing, which is a tablet of Horus, the same god that was revealed to them in the king's chamber, they stop and Rose says, that's the one, there he is, that's who we communicated with the other night. And when they look at the Stele of Revealing, it has the number 666 on it, which is Aleister Crowley's personal number. And can it get any weirder and freakier than that? I would say absolutely not. So, obviously, Aleister knows he's hit the jackpot on this one, according to him, and he's ready to do whatever it takes. So from here, Aleister and Rose leave the museum, and they go to a hotel in Cairo. And Aleister spends the next 3 days channeling a book called the Book of the Law. Now he claims that this book was dictated to him from an entity named Aiwass, A-I-W-A-S-S, through automatic writing. So Aleister's in the hotel, he knows how to astral project, and he knows how to do transcendental meditation, he knows how to empty himself, he knows how to let spirits in. And according to him, this entity named Aiwass comes in and does automatic writing, which is where the entity controls you and it does the writing. And he produces this book called the Book of the Law. Now, later in the Equinox of the Gods, Crowley states that as he sat at his desk, the voice of Aiwass
came from over his left shoulder and told him what to write. Also, Aiwass told Crowley that mankind was on the doorstep of a new era in the spiritual evolution of humanity, to be known as the Eon of Horus. Also, the Eon of Horus, the word eon means age, okay? And the Eon of Horus was really the birth of the New Age movement. Now, we've been talking a lot about the New Age movement. There's a lot of people who are involved with this movement. People like Helena Blavatsky, who was in the Theosophical Society, who was also communicating with the Ascended Masters over in Tibet, right? She wrote a bunch of doctrines about this spiritual evolution and the New Age. You've got Helena and Nicholas Roerich, who were part of that same movement, who also were communicating with the Ascended Masters. You have Alice Bailey and many other people that we'll discuss later. But here we see another person who's really responsible, another primary moving force of this New Age movement, and it's Aleister Crowley, and he's received this through this channeled book. Now, within this book, the Book of the Law, the primary precept of this New Age is, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. And I want you to remember that, because that's going to surface again. That is the theme of this book, if you will. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. Essentially, do what you want. All of those mottos that we kind of grew up hearing and later in the 50s, well, actually not the 50s, more like the 60s and 70s, the kind of like, if it feels good, do it, you only live once type of mentality. That is the era that's being described here. So the book teaches that this new Eon of Horus would release mankind from its need to be altruistic, from its obsession of fear and death, and from its consciousness of sin. Now I want you to think about that for a second. I mean, that's basically the antithesis to what the Bible and Scripture teaches. The Bible teaches you do need to be altruistic towards mankind. Jesus said the golden rule is love the Lord with all your mind, all your heart, and all your soul. And then number 2, love your neighbor as yourself. Here, the Book of the Law is saying, you know what? You're releasing mankind from its need to be altruistic towards one another. Don't worry about your neighbor. Just do what feels best for you. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. Secondly, it releases you from the obsession of fear and death. Whereas the Bible says, you know what? You need to, fear God with your own, come to God with your own fear and salvation, because, what does Jesus say? Don't worry about the one who can take your life, but worry about the one who can take your soul. And so, of course, we do have to fear judgment in the afterlife. And then lastly, this book teaches that we don't really need to be conscious of our sin anymore. And obviously that's a complete contradiction to the Scripture. And so you can see that this book clearly has the spirit of Antichrist within it. And it's clearly what Timothy said would be in the final days, the didache daimonia, doctrines of devils, that many would fall away to the doctrines of devils. And this is clearly one of them. So we're going to get into this in greater detail. But as I said, Aiwass's teaching would spark the hippie movement, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the free love and peace mentality where you can just do what you want. Now, to give you some perspective on just how powerful Crowley was and this book, this isn't some book that got written and then just got thrown into the dust bin in the corner. Crowley became internationally famous guy. Every one of the people on the bottom left are people who have on some level followed Crowley. The Beatles, they were big followers of Crowley. They put a picture of him on the cover of their Sgt. Pepper's album along with other people that they followed. And they had lyrics and things in their music that pertained to Crowley. Led Zeppelin was a big follower of Crowley. Jimmy Page bought Aleister Crowley's old house in Loch Ness, Scotland. Yeah, I said Loch Ness, where the Loch Ness Monster is. Frank Zappa, Ozzy Osbourne wrote a famous song called Mr. Crowley. Down, 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 down. And sorry, guys, that's as good as I can do, but it's actually, when you listen to that song, it reminds me of the Muse thing where it's got that that hypnotic kind of rhythm to it that you just can lose yourself in a trance in it. David Bowie, huge occultist, Iron Maiden, The Doors, Hall & Oates, Marilyn Manson, every one of these people are Crowley followers. They all have songs and music and lyrics that talk about Crowley. Lady Gaga, Sting, Mick Jagger, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Katy Perry. I realize it may be hard to believe, but I assure you, all these people are very familiar with Crowley. They're very familiar with his books. So over here on the right, you see the Book of the Law. And of course, you see, in this situation, you see kind of a weird looking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. This is an 8-pointed star inside of a circle. So that's a more sophisticated symbol. And I thought it was interesting because, in the Bible, the old book in the Pentateuch with the commandments is called the Book of the Law. That's what God gave the Israelites. It's referred to as the Book of the Law. And now we have Aleister Crowley dictating a different book from a spiritual entity called Aiwass, who is the representative of Horus, which he received from the Cairo Museum, which was brought to him from the king's chamber through a bornless ritual. It's just hard to keep it straight. It's so complicated.